welcome to Asking Autistics, the autistic podcast. I am your host, Lindsey, Brains and Spoons.
I'm Rebecca, or Riki, Rivera Bonbon.
And today we are talking about our special interests, and we're going to do a little bit of an info dump. A special interest is something that many autistic people have. It is a passionate focus. Some people will even say it's a bit obsessive. And it is a long-term passion, a long-term interest, not just a hobby. It is something that we are very focused on can be even most of your life, honestly.
It's more than just like a passion. It's more than something that somebody just has like a lot of interest in. Because I hear a lot of people who don't have autism use the term special interest. And I'm like, you're not using it correctly. Because a special interest, like you can have a hyperfixation that is absolutely real for non-autism neurotypes. But when you are autistic, a special interest is something that actually deeply affects your day-to-day life. And that's the difference between a special interest and a hyperfixation. Like, if I don't have access to my special interest, I will have a meltdown. If something happens to my sharks, or if I have a Disneyland trip planned and it gets canceled, that's like a double whammy of routine and special interest. Like, that's guaranteed meltdown.
That can definitely play a part in special interests. But for some autistic people, there are specific topics that we are drawn to, we learn a lot about. We incorporate that into conversations whenever we possibly can, even if it's really awkward. And so special interest can be a more physical manifestation of something, but it can also be a concept that you are just really, really fixated on. And
like you live in like nerdy stuff, but you love to study and talk about birds.
Yes, well, and actually today's special interest info dump is combining several of my special interests. And so,
okay,
I'm going to be talking about the bird heist, okay, which combines the Victorian-era and corvids, which are two of my favorite things to talk about. So I'm very excited here.
Okay.
So let's give you a little bit of background, starting in my favorite special interest in historical period, the Victorian era. Now, during this time, various European powers, especially Britain, were going out and colonizing, taking over the rest of the world. They were, quote unquote, discovering countries that had already been there and people that had already populated those countries. But
they were discovering these countries that had already been discovered.
Exactly. And so the British were violently taking over the world. Part of that drive that they had was to find what they thought were new to them species of animals. And so you get this rise of what we call naturalists. And that would be someone like Darwin or Wallace. And these were men who would go on voyages and end up in parts of the world that previous British folks had not been in. And they would discover, if you're watching me on video, I'm using air quotes because, again, these were not new creatures to the indigenous peoples, but to the British, they were. And so what they would do is find different species and they started naming them. They came up with systems of categorization that we still use today.
Are these like the Latin names for stuff and everything?
Yes. Creating Latin names for things. And yes, coming up with the species, genus, all of those things were being done at this time. And actually Wallace, who is one of the naturalists that is a part of this story, his labeling system, his way of categorizing birds and making sure that you listed the latitude, longitude, basically the area you found them in, and give as much information as you possibly could and tagged it, made like a little paper tag that you would put onto this animal specimen. Because when I say specimen, they were not taking many live creatures. They did on occasion, but in general, they would catch creatures catch these birds in particular, and then they would preserve them in a certain way. Like the wings would be tucked in. It would be very like a little ball of a bird, so that they could bring back all of these samples to Britain to study them. And one of the major places that these samples ended up was the British Museum.
Of course,
in fact, the
where
British
all stolen
Museum
things go.
the British Museum has been called the world's largest receiver of stolen goods.
Yeah.
So yes, this was again that time period where the British Museum stole priceless artifacts and endangered species that are now endangered, from cultures all over the world. So just in case you were wondering why many different countries don't seem to have a lot of ancient artifacts, that's because they're in the British Museum.
Let me just say, if the British Museum has no haters, I'm dead.
I would say hating the British Museum has got to be one of my favorite pastimes. And so, speaking of the British Museum, part
Hot
of this
chocolate
is that,
just almost came out of my nose.
so these bird specimens that Darwin and Wallace were collecting, many of them ended up at the British History Museum. And some of these are, those big stuffed creatures that you see on displays, but a lot of these scientific specimens, these bird specimens, were actually placed in basically cabinets with drawers. It's how they keep a lot of specimens from being destroyed, from being damaged at all, is they've got these back rooms that are just full of ancient artifacts and specimens that do not go on display. People are not allowed to look at them or touch them.
So they just hoard them for no reason?
Sort of. In the beginning, they did they hoard a lot of things. However, in this particular case, with the bird specimens, scientists are able to use them to research things like climate change. And so,
Okay.
if you
All right, that's fair.
have a perfectly preserved bird from the early 1800s, and this is like, let's say, a seabird, okay, you could pluck a feather and test the levels of mercury or fill in the blank that is in that DNA of that creature from that very specific time period, and use that to compare over the years to how different levels of things are rising and falling and things of that nature.
So if you happen to be one of our listeners and you have one of these birds, you know where to send it.
Yeah, so even though the British Museum is the greatest thief in the world, some of the things that they do have specimens of are scientifically and historically very important. And that also plays into our story. And so, while in the Victorian era, Wallace and Darwin and other naturalists have, quote unquote, discovered all of these beautiful birds, a lot of trends started taking off. People went crazy for birds. And now these are tropical birds. Okay. Things like birds of paradise. These are beautiful. Think of a peacock, okay, with all the gorgeous feathers. Think of macaws and parrots that
So
just have these
pretty.
brilliant, beautiful feathers, okay, in striking colors. That is what everybody wanted, but not as a pet, as fashion, as hobbies. And so people were then sending out poachers, essentially, to get feathers because women wanted to wear them as part of their hats. Feathered hats started in the Victorian era and just took off and were still popular all the way through the 1950s. Feathers in fashion was one of the worst things that could have happened to bird species, to the environment, but people were ravenous. So it was men and women, but mostly women, being obsessed with feathers as couture fashion pieces. And so that led to making a lot of birds endangered. And then on the flip side, in the Victorian era, you had fly fishing, which, okay, I know, it sounds, you're like, what? Well, what does that have to do with tropical birds? fly
Hold on.
fishing.
Wait, what even is fly fishing? Because I have
Okay.
heard that term. I do not know what it is. And
Okay.
my brain will go to the weirdest places.
So you're not fishing for an insect. You're not like flying in the air. None of that.
That's what I thought it was. I thought you get on a plane and you're flying. And I'm like, that seems like a stupid way to fish.
No. So fly fishing is a type of fishing where people make their own lures that look like insects and they get into the water typically. So when you see those guys in what they call waders, like those big waterproof overalls, and they're standing in a river and they're casting their fishing rod into the river, these lures. So instead of using worms or chicken livers, which is like in the South, that's real common. Like you go get you some night crawlers, you get some chicken livers, and that's how you go
Chicken liver
get
is
catfish
delicious, by the way.
and things like that. Okay, so
see, I think that my version in my head is the more interesting version of the sport. So I'm just going to ignore everything that you just said and pretend like the cool version.
we're gonna
is
talk
real.
about it more. It's gonna get way weirder.
Okay.
Basically, the general populace, your peasants, your working class folks, they're fishing with the baits and things like I've already talked about. Okay, they are fishing for food. But when you get into the elite, the wealthy, when you get into the nobility in Britain and in Europe, but mostly in Britain, they of course have to make it a really elite sport, right? That fishing, they can't just fish for food, heaven forbid. So what they start doing
they have
with
too
fly
much
fishing,
money.
yes, right. They start fixating on the making of these lures, the making of the little flies. What the flies are is a fake insect. And they start using things like gold thread, silver thread, and rare bird feathers. And they start making more intricate designs to where you might need a dozen different species worth of feathers and precious, metals in your wiring that you're using. So they would require possibly more than a dozen rare birds in order to make one teeny tiny little fishing lure that most of them didn't even use. They collected them.
You're kidding.
No. Like most niche communities and nerdy obsessions, people became fixated on the making of this craft projects for the nobility. And so they weren't even worried about the fishing as much as they were trying to outdo one another in the intricacy and rarity of these flies, of these fishing lures. And so women have a fashion that's obsessed with feathers, and rich men also have, an obsession with feathers. And as we can predict, that now over all these years leads to a ton of endangered species and a few extinct species of tropical birds. And so
so you're telling me that like climate change is not entirely to blame for the loss of these tropical birds? It's just these like jerks
human
who
greed
that
plays a huge part into, well, and we see this now with poaching that still goes on. We look at things like the white rhino. Okay, there are many animals that have gone extinct, and birds like the dodo bird that we will never see because they were hunted to extinction. They were poached. They were taken as trophies and by hobbyists. And so, and it didn't all happen, obviously, during the Victorian era, but there was a huge push for this. And of course, that's my time period that I'm obsessed with. So I love it when it ties into a good story.
Right? It's like two special interests in one.
So that is the backstory. That's your information of why there happen to be bird specimens in the British History Museum. And I'm talking like thousands, okay? And it was because of the naturalists and all of these things. And now all of those are rare, incredibly rare, possibly priceless because of how endangered and a lot of these species are. And then we come to the early 2000s. And there is a passionate, very niche community of fly fishermen online. Mostly they have little conventions, but mostly they're in these little chat rooms. They have their own little, websites and web groups. For any of our listeners who were not possibly alive in the early 2000s.
Oh my God.
So old.
Same.
This was the height of things like MySpace and LiveJournal, and building these little GeoCities, building little chat rooms where you and your friends could talk about very specific,
very niche
rare
stuff.
Niche, yes, right? So this is where obsessions came from. This is where Tumblr started. Okay, these are
Otaku.
Yes, these are the types of communities that were flourishing online in the early 2000s.
This led to Reddit, 4chan, Tumblr,
Yeah,
like all of
exactly.
those came from
We
this.
didn't have TikTok yet. None of that. It was all these little chat rooms.
And let me just say, MySpace, I'm pretty sure, led to the careers of so many graphic designers because you get to design your own little website. It was so cool.
We all learned HTML
Yeah.
for like a one short period of time. There was a 5 to 10 year period where millennials all learned how to code. And then, it went back into the ether.
We all forgot about it.
But that is the setting of our story. So there is this little niche community of fly fishermen who have these books with pictures and things that were written in the Victorian era, showing these really intricate, colorful fishing lures, the fly tying guides. And many of them started fixating on these, going, oh, I just wish that we could get a hold of these bird feathers. Like, it's not fair that we have to use knockoffs, because they're allowed to use common birds. Okay, you can use chicken feathers and turkey feathers and all kinds of things. But in their minds, that wasn't good enough. They needed the real deal. They needed birds of paradise.
Right.
They needed these, because sometimes when you get in these groups, especially historically based groups, and I've obviously been in some Victorian groups, that's actually where I heard this story was in a Reddit group that was about the Victorian era.
I love that for you.
So see, where all of our little weirdos come together in this particular little niche hobby, and it is majority men. I have yet to find any women that were a part of this. So I'm sure there might be one or two out there, but as far as in this context, in this timeline, there weren't. So it is a mostly middle-aged men who, the further into this hobby they got, they're not even fishing mostly at this point. They are tying lures. And it is such an intricate thing. They're tiny. These are not big. Okay. This is like the size of a wine cork. Okay. Is what you're doing. And so people have these big magnifiers and all these things. It's a very delicate, specific hobby. Mm-hmm. Well, as a part of this hobby group, there is a teenager. He's homeschooled, and his name is Edwin Rist. And Edwin's parents were both college professors, and they homeschooled him. And so basically any interest that he had, anything that he hyperfixated on, they encouraged him to learn. So he knew multiple different art styles. He played multiple instruments. He was actually a prodigy flautist. He was an amazing flute player, but he went through quite a few very niche, unusual hobbies. Every time he got into one of these things, his family encouraged him to dive in and learn more, and they would take him to the library, wherever he needed to go. So Edwin stumbles upon fly fishing lures, and this is his jam. All of his previous hobbies, he throws them by the wayside, and he dives into this community. He starts being mentored by the closest fly fishermen to his location, to his community and his state. And he joins all these message groups, and he starts going to these little conventions. And he becomes one of the best, if not the best, fly tying expert in this community. So not only is he a flute prodigy, but he is a fly tying prodigy as well. And so in his little bubble, his small fishing pond, he becomes this big deal. Like everyone's like, oh my gosh, Edwin, have you seen what Edwin Rist can do? Tying these fly fishing. And he now starts to have the same lament that other men in the community do, where he's like, it's not good enough for me to use these regular feathers. I want to use these rare feathers. Like, oh, if only I had these rare feathers, I could build the most beautiful fishing lures. Like, I could finally, get the piece de resistance to my collection. Okay, so he starts, like many other people in his community, obsessing over finding these bird feathers. Things like birds of paradise and other birds that I can't think of off the top of my head, but highly endangered, okay? And highly illegal to traffic in. So you can't actually get a hold of these things, not just because they're rare, but because they're endangered. And we have laws about this, like global policies in place about poaching and buying and selling endangered species. That means that you cannot get your hands on these. Okay. And so what people would do is they would wait for, let's say, a wealthy collector, someone who might have had like stuffed bird species, or women who had old hats in a collection. And so when great grandma died, they would try to bid on these things, hoping that they could get one of these rare feathers. Okay. They're constantly talking about it in these chat rooms. Like this was their obsession. And some point, one of the members of the group visits the British History Museum, and he tells the group, he laments to them, oh my gosh, this little museum has thousands of rare birds. And he emails with them. He tries to ask this museum, will you sell me? I want to buy one of these rare birds for you. Will you sell me the feathers? And the museum is like, no, we use these for scientific research. You creepy dude, we're not selling these for you to make a fishing lure. Right? And so that gets into Edwin's head. But for the time being, he's like, okay, well, I have to keep doing my schoolwork. And I guess this is a dream that won't come true. Well, Edwin is also a prodigy when it comes to flute playing. He is a flautist, and he gets a scholarship to, I believe, the Royal Academy, which is in Great Britain. So Edwin finds himself at this musical school, which is like an elite institution. Okay, this is not a big this is such a big deal in itself. And he is playing his flute, and he starts to obsess over the idea of getting a golden flute, because the flute he plays on is good, but it's not good enough. He could be, in his mind, the greatest flute player in the world if he had a golden flute. But that would take a lot of money, and Edwin's not rich and his parents aren't rich. So gosh, where in the world could he get the money for a golden flute? And then he remembers that conversation that he had with the people in his fly tying group, his fly fishing group, that there's a museum not very far from where he goes to school that has all of these rare bird specimens.
Oh.
And so Edwin types out a Word document on how to attack the museum.
No.
Yes. So Edwin starts planning his museum heist, the Great Bird Heist. And when you think about heists, I don't know about you, but I think about that Muppet movie where they drop down on a bungee cord from the roof and to steal a diamond. I'm thinking lasers, very high tech, right?
I believe that was Muppets in Space.
No, I believe it's actually Muppets Take Manhattan or The Great Muppet Caper might have been. But anyway, so I'm thinking old school movies, right? Catherine Zeta-Jones bending her way through these lasers. Like, I'm thinking heist like Ocean's 11, where you've got a whole crew of people and everybody has a part. Edwin takes a backpack and a suitcase. He breaks a window in the back of the museum and he rolls the suitcase over to the back rooms where they keep all of these specimens, again, in cabinets and things. They're not on display. This is like a storage, a very pristine, climate-controlled storage space, but it is still a storage space. And he starts stuffing birds into his backpack and this suitcase. And now when Edwin talked about it later on, he said initially he just thought he would take a couple, like just a couple birds so that he could tie these, beautiful fishing lures and that maybe he could sell the feathers and get enough to like upgrade his flute. But Edwin ends up taking about 300 bird species. 300 birds.
You're kidding. How big was this backpack?
So that's also a very interesting thing because we only have Edwin's side of the story to base this on. There were no witnesses. They didn't
keep track of how many they had?
They did, but here's the thing is that remember this time period, okay? This is before everything is digitized. This is pre-internet connects all of us to every detail, okay? Things were cataloged in paper lists sometimes. Things were put into cabinets. They went from the official, the big museum to what this was. This was a secondary museum in Trin, which is a place in Britain that I had never heard of. So this isn't London. This isn't lasers and stuff. This is a small history museum where this is where they've decided to keep the bird specimens. Edwin takes almost 300 birds, around 300 birds in his backpack and suitcase, which is possibly $1 million worth of birds. And he climbs back out the window and walks to the train station and goes home. Okay. And you're thinking like, oh my gosh, like there had to be alarms. There has to be security. Yeah, there is a security guard. Okay. But it's a small town. This is not a big splashy museum. And the items that they think are the most precious are on display, jewels and artifacts. That is in a separate section. That is where the security guard hangs out. That's where there's a camera. Okay? Edwin went in the back storage room.
I bet they learned their lesson now.
Yeah. So a few weeks later, a museum worker realizes that a window's been broken and they start freaking out that, oh my gosh, like somebody broke into the museum.
Weeks later?
It may have been a week. Okay, so a short time later,
they didn't notice the next day.
They discover within a short period of time, but longer than it's, you'd think, that a window has been broken. And so they're like, oh my gosh, we've been robbed. And they start looking for things. And they go look at all their valuable exhibits. Nothing was taken. So they're thinking, you know what? We've had teenagers busting windows and graffitiing cars and things. Like, I bet it was just some crazy kids, pranking stuff. Probably not a big deal. Okay. Then.
And the history of the most incompetent museum owners has concluded.
Yes. This is actually, this is like a horror story. This is one of those stories that all museums have learned from at this point. At some point down the road, somebody comes in and they need to do some scientific work and they need some bird specimens. They go to the storage unit and realize there's birds missing. And that starts the ball rolling where everybody starts freaking out now. And that's when they start having to go back through the catalogs. They go through all the cabinets because, again, these are not specimens that you see every day, okay? These are in the storage room. And they realize we were really robbed. This is possibly the worst, biggest museum heist like that
Ever?
anyone had ever seen. And so, but now at this point, they have very little evidence. The trail seems to have gone cold. Like, where could these possibly be? They start thinking that there are these poaching rings, these theft rings, the way that we think about when it comes to like art theft and stuff. So those are the types of people that they're looking at. Okay. That is where their suspicions lie. Meanwhile, back at the Royal Academy of Music, Edwin has been plucking feathers off of these bird specimens and selling them little bit by little bit to his fly fishing friends on these tiny little websites, on these little back chat rooms, on eBay, but not on these fancy black market type things that
Just on eBay.
the authorities were looking at, okay? It's all these little tiny fly fishing groups. Nobody was thinking to look there. And so Edwin is selling, groups of birds, and he keeps saying, oh, I have a collector friend, or I know someone who just recently passed away, or I'm doing this, as a favor to such and such. He had all these reasons. And so a lot of people were like, oh, okay, that sounds legit. Like, I want to participate in this auction. And even if they questioned it, they didn't want to know because they wanted these bird feathers so badly.
Oh my God.
Well, word gets out now that they've realized that the birds are missing, and now it's a news story. Okay, there's major museum heists, 300 birds missing, like, priceless things. And on the chat boards, once or twice, somebody does bring it up and they're like, oh, that's crazy. Whoa, I can't even imagine. Like, well, they should. Sometimes people even said, well, they should have sold us a couple of them and then maybe it wouldn't have happened. And so they had all kinds of debate going back and forth.
Wow, that's crazy. Clicks add to cart.
Yes, exactly. Very much so. There was a lot of hypocrisy going on. Like, whoa, I wonder who could have done it. Yeah, clicks add to cart on rare bird feathers that Edwin mysteriously has.
So Edwin's mysterious birdfeathers.ebay.com.
Yes. Edwin even tells them he's doing this to get his golden flute. So it literally will say, like, I forget his exact screen name, but it's like Golden Flute Boy 89. Okay? Like bird feathers 89. It's one of those things looking back on it where you're like, how did they not see this?
Get caught?
Right? So all of this happens, and then he's in college. He goes back to the States to stay with his family because he's not British, and then he comes back to his dorms. So all this is going on. Okay. So it is so much time has gone by. The case has gone cold. When one of the investigators, somebody hears about these fly fishermen and how they have managed to find all of these rare feathers to make their flies. And they start looking this up and realizing, wait a second, that's the type of bird we're looking for. That's another one we're looking for. That's another one. And all of a sudden, they realize,
my
gosh, all of the birds from the museum are being sold on these little chat room boards. And so they find Edwin. He immediately confesses he's got birds samples in his little apartment, in his dorm room. Okay, they're still, they're like in his suitcase under his bed. It's crazy. So they arrest him and he goes to trial. And his lawyer says Edwin's kind of a weirdo and he gets really fixated.
I wonder where they got that idea.
Right? He gets really fixated on things like a golden flute and Victorian and fishing lures, fly tying. And so they have him tested for, at the time, what they called Asperger's. So they have him tested for autism. And the psychologist says that, yes, Edwin is autistic. And
chaotic, evil autism.
Mm-hmm. And because there had been a case or even two cases, one of them made more sense with this. there was a precedent for giving autistic people a lighter sentence. So Edwin did not serve any jail time for stealing $1 million worth of rare birds, possibly the largest heist, historical specimen heist in the world, because of his autism diagnosis. And I want to make it very clear here, there has been speculation, and if you read articles about this or books about this where people speculate whether he is or is not autistic, whether he has some other sort of, mental health issue or neurodivergence. However, that is not up to us to decide. No. But what I do want to point out is, as a fellow autistic person, autistic people know the difference between right and wrong.
We do.
Okay? Being autistic does not mean that you should steal $1 million worth of rare birds from a museum.
Yeah, don't steal $1 million worth of rare birds. Steal $1 million, period.
Being autistic does not mean you were a thief. It does not mean that you have no moral compass. Okay? This was a genius legal maneuver by this lawyer, but as a fellow autistic person, it is complete BS to let someone have completely scot-free off of a crazy crime because they're autistic. See, it's not an excuse. Autism is never an excuse.
Here's the reason I think Lindsey says that this is not an excuse. It's because Lindsey is obsessed with birds as her special interest. And she's like, this is not an excuse because you didn't give me the bird.
No, I honestly, I am such a advocate for scientific research that the idea that somebody would deface this for what I feel is a pointless, obscure hobby, that it upsets me. But that...
No, same. I was just joking, but still.
No, I get it. It's so bonkers to me how all of my favorite things combine into one story. Literally, the Victorian-era, rare birds, autism. Oh, the same wild story. And so we still honestly don't know the full truth of the situation. They didn't find all the birds. Edwin had sold so many of them that the collectors were like, I don't know where they could be. These fly fishermen got real quiet. However, there is a writer, Kirk Wallace Johnson, and he, as a fly fisherman, the kind that actually fishes, heard this story and became obsessed, and he investigated it, and he has this wonderful book called The Feather Thief that you can find out all the details that I left out, get a more specific timeline. And I mean, he went about this. He did this like it's a true crime podcast. He interviewed everybody, and he is actually the reason, the author of the book, this random dude who heard a story one time fishing and said, I need to be the detective on this. He actually guilted a lot of people into returning their specimens to the museum.
Good.
He found out way more information, honestly, than the police did. It is such an amazing, bizarre story, and everybody should read it, listen to the audiobook, but I found this originally, not knowing there was a book or anything, was several years ago when the case happened. I was getting the play-by-play on like a little Victorian Reddit thread. They were like, oh my gosh, did you hear about this? So wild.
That is insane. That would make a really hilarious heist comedy.
It would be a phenomenal movie. Why is this not a movie? But the money should not go to Edwin Rist because they don't know how much money he ever ended up with. He bought himself that golden flute. He took trips around the world. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands and thousands of dollars. He was a very wealthy college student.
People are like, where did you get this money? You're in college. Fly fishing.